If Stephen Harper's government was known for anything, it surely was his tough-on-crime, law and order agenda. Tasha Kheiriddin is a public policy analyst, commentator, and radio host on AM 640 in Toronto, and she joins us now to consider the legacy of the Harper Justice Agenda. Tasha, good to see you again.
Good to see you too, Steve.
Did Stephen Harper, when he became Prime Minister, truly have the belief that he wanted to utterly transform Canada's justice system?
I think that belief evolved. I think that it was always part of the conservative agenda, if you will. It's part of the basic conservative belief system, a belief in order, philosophically speaking. I think it evolved in a sense. It became even more important than it had been during the 2005 election campaign because of events that unfolded during the campaign. And those events, I think the reaction to them, the murder of Jane Kriba in Toronto, sort of galvanized the law and order issue as something very important. It took preeminence then in the platform. The notion of punitive justice became something on which the Conservatives started to hang their hat.
Well, and it really got torqued to the nth degree one day in Parliament when Vic Taves, the then Justice Minister, said what?
You're either with the pornographers or you're against us. And that was with regard to additional punishments for child pornography offenses. The government took a very strong line on those kinds of offenses because it knew that resonated with people. There had been cases of pornography and people who engaged in that had made the headlines. People were angry at what they saw as low sentences, or in some cases, pornography actually being excused because it was in written form and not in depicting children. There was that whole conversation, what is pornography in the criminal code? So the government understandably toughened its penalties for that and for those kinds of offenses, and you weren't going to find the opposition starting to defend the pornographers, though the line itself did generate a lot of controversy.
I was going to say, that was I mean, everybody's used to brass knuckles in politics, and particularly in question period.
It was tough.
But when Taves said, you're either with us or you're with the child pornographers, that seemed to cross a line with a lot of people, right?
Yes, it definitely did. And I think that you saw people then, I think, start to question the agenda, not necessarily for whether it would make Canada safer or whether there were actual issues, such as child pornography on the internet, which is a real serious issue, but the government was using it or positioning it for political gain.
Okay, let's bring up this graphic now. Sheldon, I'm board number 1 here. This is entitled A New Sheriff in Town, and here is some of what the Harper government did during its almost decade in office. Mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses, sex crimes, crimes against children, some violent offenses, increasing penalties under the Young Offenders Act, create a federal ombudsman for victims of crime, a tougher approach to white-collar crime, eliminate entitlements for prisoners, that refers to the old age security, eliminate the faint hope clause for killers, and passed Bill C-51, the anti-terrorism law. Generally speaking, as a package, sort of looking down from 30,000 feet, as they say, what's Harper trying to say with this group of reforms?
The government had 2 approaches. One was to emphasize the importance of victims. The Victims Ombudsman was a new position. It was created to specifically reference the role of the victim, increase the role of the victim. In fact, when I talked to people about this, Peter MacKay said one of his proudest accomplishments as a Minister of the Crown dealing with these issues was that he increased the presence of victims, the fact they would be compensated, the fact they had more of a say at hearings, in sentencing, and this kind of thing. The other was to roll back what they called Club Fed, as you said, things like old age security benefits, or in many cases, things that prisoners would have access to in prison, the so-called lifestyle issues. And the government harped on that because it had the sense that people were angry that their tax dollars and their supporters, conservatives in particular, would be going to make life easy for prisoners. So they rolled back those things, even if some of them were rather symbolic, such as the old age security.
I do want to ask you about those supporters, because it was a constant question, I guess, to ask during the Harper decade as to whether or not he was really doing this because he firmly in his heart believed this was a more just Canada that would result at the end of the day, or whether he knew this was just the greatest red meat that his small c conservative base would eat up. Which was it?
I think it was a little of both. Like I said, I think that the Conservatives as a group, as a movement or party, have always been stronger on law and order issues in terms of where they position themselves on the political spectrum. However, it was clear that there was a market for this as well and among Conservative supporters. And it's partly explained also, as I said, by instances during the first election campaign where he was elected, but also the crime rate had ticked up slightly before that. There was the so-called year of the gun in in Toronto in 2005. These were real issues. People were concerned about that uptick in crime, violent crime, despite the fact that, in fact, since the 1990s, violent crime had actually been decreasing. But that small increase, that surge that people saw, was something that put the issues top of mind. And I think that is why the Conservatives also saw that there was a political market for it.
But that was the point, what you said. I mean, from the 90s on, the line on the graph, if you were to look at it over a 20 or 30-year span, the line on the graph went down. I mean, there might have been that one uptick in that 1 year, but the line basically was going down. And criminologists and others were saying to the Conservatives, you know, what you are proposing flies in the face of what the evidence suggests. Did the Harper government therefore at all back down on what it was doing because the evidence suggested to go in a different direction?
No, the Conservatives did not, and they brought in Bill C-10, omnibus bill, with many other provisions, mandatory minimums for drug crimes, for example, and other issues. They toughened laws on internet-related crimes, which arguably those crimes had not been in existence before. So tracking them, yes, those crimes were increasing. But they also did things like 2-for-1 in sentencing. They eliminated that, so people who had served time when they were waiting sentencing were not giving 2-for-1 credit, as judges usually did. These kinds of measures were there, I would say, less necessarily to protect the public, but to give a sense that justice was being served, which is what the voters wanted to hear. This, of course, though, also increased the prison population greatly, which was costly to taxpayers, something that sort of contradicted a bit of what the Conservatives were about as well.
And yet, between 1980 and 2012, almost 1,200 Aboriginal women were either murdered or went missing. And the Prime Minister's view was to treat this as a criminal matter rather than as a sociological phenomenon. How does that view stand up all these years later?
Well, we know we have the inquest now into murdered and missing Aboriginal women, and the Conservatives are on board with that. Their new leader, the interim leader, Ronna Ambrose, supported that initiative when the Liberals announced it. I think Mr. Harper, that was one of those moments that started to turn the tide against what the Conservatives were doing, not necessarily among hardcore Conservative supporters, but among the middle ground, maybe blue Liberals or other people who might have supported the Conservatives, to say, when he said this was just criminal and there was no sociological or other element to the fact that these women were murdered, a lot of people started to question, well, what is the rationale for your tough on crime agenda? And it was also seen as very hard-hearted. And I think that, again, flew in the face of what the Conservatives had tried to say, which is, we are here for victims. And these women were also, these were victims, but nobody seemed to consider their crimes or their murders on the same level as other victims who were receiving restitution or other things.
So he kind of got the tone wrong on that one.
The tone was wrong, and I think that was, again, there was a number of things in different areas of Conservative policy, but that heart-of-heart narrative was something the Liberals used very well in the 2015 election against the Conservatives.
Because he was in office for so long, he got to make 8 appointments to the Supreme Court of Canada. Is the Supreme Court of Canada noticeably more conservative as a result of those appointments?
I would say it's not, actually. And that is, in terms of leaving a legacy, I think Mr. Harper, the Conservatives definitely, they wanted things like more women on the bench. It was something that they actually did try and achieve, despite criticism that they didn't necessarily appoint women to these positions. They actually did want to appoint them to various levels of courts, including the Supreme Court. Mr. Harper, I don't think, wanted to appear as though he was torquing the Supreme Court to a conservative end. And one of his appointments, of course, which failed, which was Marc Nadon, that one failed in spectacular fashion and really was, it backfired on him. That was a person who had been quite conservative in terms of supporting the government, at least in its position on terrorist issues, and there was a particular terrorist case that he rendered a minority decision on. So I think that when Mr. Harper did, when he got in the big fight with the Supreme Court, with Beverly McLaughlin over that appointment, that, again, was a black eye to the government in terms of the way it operated. It wasn't seen as something that was, dignified to do, to attack a Supreme Court justice over the rejection of an appointment.
It was pretty extraordinary, though, for the Supreme Court of Canada to say it's illegal for you to appoint this judge to our bench.
It was, but this is, I think, symptomatic of some of the problems. When I talk to people who worked in the Department of Justice or were close to it in writing this particular chapter, the overall expression was that the government didn't consider a lot of the views of the bureaucracy. It didn't consider, it wanted things done, and it wanted them done in a certain time frame. It didn't necessarily perhaps charter-proof its legislation to the extent because it didn't give people time to do this. The same thing with the appointment of Mr. Nadon. There were red flags for the appointment, nothing to do with his competency, but simply the constitutional issues around it, that he had not practiced in Quebec for this period of time that was required to be a Quebec judge or justice from Quebec. So I think that, you know, had the government paid more attention to these things, it could have avoided problems like the tiff with Beverly McLaughlin that escalated in this case.
Here's a quote from the correctional investigator Howard Sapers that you have in your chapter. He writes, "It seems to me that if we're going to spend $117,788 each year, on average, to keep a male offender in custody, and $211,618 per year for a federally sentenced woman inmate, then we ought to make sure our society is better for it." Mm-hmm. Were you able to come to any conclusions as to whether or not our society was better for all of that spent money?
Well, yeah, this is the question you're left with. The answer is no on either stretch. It is true that Canadian streets are safer today than they were when the Conservatives took office. Whether that's a result of, you know, the $2 billion they spent on additional incarceration is not clear. Crime rates, as you said, were going down anyway. There are demographic factors which help explain lower violent crime rates when you have an aging population, and there were other trends as well. So you can't, unless you did a value for money audit, which was beyond the scope of this book, but I would encourage the federal government to do before they start simply reversing policies, as they are starting to do. I think you have to really look at that and say, were the changes worth what we spent on them? Additional incarceration, all these prioritizations of different things in the justice system, lack of emphasis on restorative justice, those kinds of things. Or would the money perhaps have yielded more dividends if we had more programs to help people not reoffend, more training in prisons, those kinds of things? The softer side, I guess, that the government, the Conservatives, did not want to do. Well,
let's, in our last 30 seconds here, then finish up on just something you made a point about asking, which is how much of the Harper law and order agenda is going to survive Justin Trudeau's first government?
Well, the courts have struck down quite a few things, including mandatory minimums for drug sentences. That's the most recent one. So the courts themselves, again, the legislation wasn't necessarily charter-proofed. We know that the Liberals are taking a look at reforming youth justice in particular, so that could be changed under their watch. They have a lot of other things on their plate now, though, so I don't know how much priority this will have. But I certainly think that the impact of the Harper years in the justice arena will be less probably than the Conservatives hoped.
Gotcha. Tasha, thanks for this.
Thank you.
Tasha Kheiriddin, who you can hear every day, 12 to 2, AM 640.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.